Hi, everyone. Many of you know me. I already know. Welcome to our 76th WildChina On-Air event. I'm Zhang Mei. I'm the founder of WildChina. And if you have been following some of our events over the past year and a half, since the beginning of the pandemic, we read a book every month. And right now we're reading this book. Monkey King, the newest translation, actually a bite-sized version of the Chinese classic that I grew up with. And it's such a dear, dear story. And I'm just delighted that Julia put it in such sort of lovely, fun language and make it now accessible to Western audience. And we will get to know a lot more about the book through the next hour. And if you're like me who grew up with the story, don't worry, it's still worth a read. And if you haven't read the book, seriously go out and get it. And I would highly recommend a print copy, because then you can sort of read with the kid or, scooch back on the couch. It's really quite enjoyable. But before I hand the room over to Julia, let me say a few words about her. Many of you may already know, may already follow her. Julia Lovell, right? Is the very well-known academic scholar on Chinese literature. Julia has published some of the most popular Chinese history books of recent times. The best-known one was the Opium War, Drugs, Dreams, and the Making of China. And Julia, in fact, I want to get a chance for us to read this book in the book club as well. And she's also this book is a just wonderful revaluation of the implications of the UK and China in the 1800s and its later implications for our modern world today. Right? And Julia's translation of literary classics have made Chinese culture really accessible and very enjoyable for English speakers across the world. And some of my favorite authors, Zhang Ailing, Lu Xun, and of course, now we have this Monkey King, right? So let me see some of the other information about Julia. Julia has begun her academic career as a student at the University of Cambridge and the Hopkins Nanjing Center of Chinese Studies, and she is now a professor of modern Chinese history and literature at the University of Birkbeck, London. So before I hand it over, just a little bit sort of run of logistics things today. Julia will take over and talk to us about 15, 20 minutes about, your thoughts on why this book and your experience and all that. Then I will kick us off with a couple of questions from me. And if any of you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand to speak or put in the chat box. And we hope to get to as many of them as possible. So thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. I will hand the room over to you.
Thanks so much, May, for that really generous introduction and also for this opportunity to speak to your wonderful book group. So May asked me to start by speaking for about 20 minutes to give an outline of this book, this translation, and maybe say why I think it matters. So my new book, Monkey King, is an abridged translation of Journey to the West, Xi and this is one of the masterworks of pre-20th century Chinese fiction. It's one of its qishu. It was first published in 1592, and it's been much beloved ever since. So I'll start with a quick plot summary with a few spoiler alerts. Its main character is a magic monkey king called Sun Wukong. And Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, has superpowers, like he can travel 108,000 miles in one leap, or he can transform himself into anything he likes. He's also unbeatable at Kung Fu, not least because he has a magic iron staff that he can enlarge and shrink at will. But he's also mischievous and arrogant, and quite early on he gets into a huge fight with the Jade Emperor, the ruler of the Taoist heaven, by guzzling all the immortal peaches, wine and elixirs that have been prepared for a once in 10,000 years banquet. Eventually, after an enormous war between the forces of heaven and monkey, the Buddha punishes monkey by imprisoning him under a mountain for 500 years. After which he's eventually released to protect a Chinese monk, a man called Tripitaka, on a dangerous pilgrimage to India to collect Buddhist scriptures. And Monkey is joined by 3 other disciples, and they're all, like him, fallen immortals who have to redeem their sins, their crimes on this pilgrimage. There's a rice-loving divine pig called Pigsy, who can fly with his ears. There's a depressive man-eating river sand monster called Sandy, and also a disobedient dragon who's disguised as a horse. And the 5 of them together have to overcome multiple rivers, mountains, and monsters on the way to India. And almost all the monsters want to eat the travelers, especially Tripitaka, because he's so virtuous that his flesh will confer immortality on them. But eventually Monkey, Tripitaka, Pigsy, Sandy, and the dragon horse reach India. They deliver the sutras back to China, then become immortals in the Buddha's monastery. So amongst many other things, the novel traces Monkey's journey, his moral arc, from troublemaker to virtuous Buddhist. Now, on one level, the book Monkey King is quite simply, it's a fun, fantastical adventure story. There are monsters of all shapes and sizes, including femme fatales, rhinoceroses, iguanas, scorpions, bulls, and there are 81 terrible challenges that the pilgrims have to overcome on their way from China to India. The pilgrims are many times over captured, tied up, they're lacquered, they're sauteed, they're steamed. At one point, a couple of them even fall pregnant. And they also come very close to being diced, boiled, liquidized, pickled, and cured by all the fearsome demons that they encounter. Every time, though, Monkey comes up with an ingenious plan, a scheme to get the pilgrims out of their tight corner and back on the road. It's, above all, a very funny book. I couldn't translate all the humour, as quite a lot of it comes in clever puns and word plays in the original Chinese. But much of it also comes through the dialogue, characterization, and the situations. The center of so much of the action is the Monkey King, it's Monkey, who really is one of the great rebels or reprobates of world literature. So Monkey is irrepressibly naughty. He's always on the move. He's always transforming into something or other. He's always coming up with a brilliant scheme to get himself and the other pilgrims out of trouble on the quest. However bad things look, Monkey's always got a joke or some backchat for whichever terrifying demon, god or ruler he's facing up to. At one particularly irreverent point, Monkey even urinates on the hand of the Buddha. And although Monkey has incredible superpowers, there's also kind of an absurd childishness to him, which can be very disarming, I think, as a character. So sometimes Monkey just doesn't think through the consequences of his actions. Early on, he guzzles all the peaches and the wine and the elixirs which are needed for this incredibly important banquet, just because they're delicious. He realizes at the end of his binge that he's going to be found out and he's going to get into trouble. And then he just decides to run away as if that's going to solve anything. Of course, he's immediately found out and heaven declares war on him. And Monkey's junior disciple, Pigsy, is a wonderfully absurd character too. He has this extraordinary capacity for power napping. So when a kung fu battle is going badly for the pilgrims, Pigsy has this tendency to dive into a nearby bush and just fall straight asleep until it's all over. The novel is also very funny, I think, in the way that it imagines heaven, the spiritual world, and the afterlife. So it tells us a lot about Chinese Taoist ideas of the supernatural. In the book, both heaven and hell are organized exactly like the government and bureaucracy on earth within the Chinese empire. You can't even die without getting the necessary approvals from the correct supernatural department. Various dragon kings are in charge of the weather, but they won't deliver rain until they have an official government edict from the ruler of heaven, the Jade Emperor. So it's as if heaven and hell are run by Jobsworth civil servants, just like the governments on the mortal world are. So the book presents this amusingly revealing idea from somewhere within Chinese culture, namely that if you become an immortal and got to heaven, what could be more heavenly than becoming an official? So all this is one way to read the novel. You can read it as an action-packed, kung fu-rich situation comedy with a hero monkey of unstoppable sassiness and a cast of delightfully ridiculous supporting characters. But there's much more to the novel than laughter. So, for example, I talked a little just now about how the book reflects some ideas within imperial China about the world of religion, about the world of spirits. And the novel more generally is full of insights into Chinese history, culture, and belief. When the book was first written, in fact, it was already a historical novel. It was about a real Buddhist monk, Tripitaka, who did indeed make a very dangerous journey out of China to India in the 620s and 630s to bring back Buddhist scriptures. So there's a historical journey at the heart of the book, and it was only in later centuries that the story of the monk Tripitaka became the focus of all this fantasy adventure and acquired the famous magic monkey disciple who came to dominate the story. The book also tells us interesting things about China's interactions with the world beyond its borders at the time that the book was written in the 16th century. So on the one hand, it's about a journey out of China. It's about fascination with foreign places, with a foreign religion, Buddhism. And it sometimes speaks admiringly of the prosperity and the beauty of the non-Chinese cities that the pilgrims encounter. But on the other hand, however far they travel, the landscape never seems to change that much, or it just repeats itself. And the pilgrims don't seem to struggle with learning foreign languages. Perhaps everybody they encounter speaks Chinese. And the Taoist heavenly religious hierarchy still holds sway, however far they travel. Even the food remains Chinese. There's fried noodles, rice, steamed buns. And right at the end, when the pilgrims return to China for a banquet with the Tang Emperor, they reflect on how, the quotation from the book goes, how great China was and how mediocre the lands of the West were by comparison. So one interesting point that perhaps comes out of the book is, is it a book about fascination with exotica, with a cosmopolitan world, or is it actually still quite China focused? Is it focused on the idea that the rest of the world is going to be quite like China? The novel is full of ideas about religion, of course. So obviously the quest at its center is a Buddhist search for enlightenment. And as he progresses west with Tripitaka, Monkey becomes noticeably more peaceful, less hasty, less angry. He becomes, in other words, a Buddhist sage. So Monkey's own story is one of Buddhist enlightenment. But the book is full of another of the great Chinese religious teachings, Taoism, as well. So it's a Taoist immortal who teaches Monkey his superpowers, and the heavenly government in charge of the world under the Jade Emperor is that of the Taoist pantheon. It's the Taoist gods and spirits. And there's a lot of Confucian belief in there too. So the novel is full of Confucian filial piety. There's a recurring joke in which monsters repeatedly fail to eat Tripitaka when they have a chance to, because they want to delay. First, they want to invite their parents to enjoy the feast too. And by the time they've got round to issuing the invitation, Monkey has always managed to waltz in with a plan to rescue Tripitaka. So there are all these different strands to the novel. I think we can call it an open text. You can read it as a madcap comedy adventure, but you can also read it as a spiritual allegory, which many Chinese readers have done over the past 500 years. They read Monkey not just as a source of mischief and comedy, but also as a metaphor for human genius, which is restless. It's prey to evil thoughts as well as able to do good. And human genius sometimes needs to be tamed to destroy demons from within the mind and in order to become enlightened. At its heart, the novel is deeply fun, deeply playful, and because it's so playful, it can often be quite subversive. There's a lot of political satire in there, so no one in authority comes off well. So the Jade Emperor, the ruler of the Taoist universe, comes over as a capricious dictator. The Buddha's chief helper, Guan Yin, a goddess called Guan Yin, delights in tormenting Monkey and making his life difficult, which is kind of a joke because Guan Yin is famously supposed to be the compassionate one. And at the end of the book, when the pilgrims have reached the Buddhist heaven in the West, in India, to pick up the scriptures, the Buddha actually almost encourages corruption in his own government of immortals when he allows his servants to demand bribes of the pilgrims before the precious Buddhist sutras are handed over. And the book is even subversive of gender roles. So at one point, the male pilgrims pass into the country of women, where there are no men, and women become pregnant by drinking from a magic river. The pilgrims don't know this, so when Tripitaka and Pigsy get thirsty, they have a drink and almost immediately start going into labour. Now, Tripitaka and Pigsy right away become quivering wrecks of fear at the prospect of childbirth, despite having already faced so many terrifying demons. So although the writer was doubtless male, there is, I think, somewhere in the book an empathetic appreciation of the trials of childbirth. And as someone who's gone into labour 3 times myself, I couldn't help but appreciate that perspective. And after Monkey gets Tripitaka and Pigsy out of that tight spot by getting them some more magic water as an antidote, the pilgrims still have to travel through the land of women and experience what is for them some very uncomfortable gender power reversals. So they're gaped at by women, they're forced into marriage. They find out what it's like to be in a world where the other sex is so much more powerful than them. And I found this imagination of a world of sexual power relations turned upside down really fascinatingly subversive for a 16th century novel. And the language in which the novel was written also mattered. In its time, it was very innovative. For much of imperial Chinese history, poetry and essays written in classical Chinese are the prestigious elite things for educated people to write. But Journey to the West was originally written not in classical Chinese, but in a 16th century vernacular Chinese. So this vernacular Chinese is very different from contemporary Chinese, but it's much more relaxed and accessible than classical Chinese, which is very compressed, very elliptical. And when it was first published, and for centuries afterwards, Journey to the West was in many ways revolutionary and certainly enormously refreshing for the way that it combined all classes of characters. So you had kings, emperors, princesses, courtiers, gods, spirits, demons. You have humanoid animals like Pigsy and Monkey, peasants, woodcutters, soldiers, and labourers. And the book combines all sorts of language. So you have pompous, courtly, classical Chinese spoken by officials, and then you have Monkey's quickfire, smart backchat. So this kind of language, this kind of novel had an immediacy and accessibility that elite writing didn't have. So at the heart of Journey to the West, there's an intensely humanizing, democratizing vision of culture and literature. The novel and the project in general, I thought was very important because of the book's influence and popularity, because it's such a cornerstone text in Chinese literary culture. it remains a crucial imaginative resource for audiences in East Asia and across the global Sinophone diaspora. So the book's stories and characters are recognizable in the way that Anglophone audiences recognize settings and characters from Shakespeare or Dickens. And Journey to the West has passed on and flourished through the last 500 years, often in the multiple adaptations that have been made of the story in abridgments, sequels, theatre, opera, and in the 20th century in comics, animations, film, song, and recently even in video games. And perhaps May would disagree here, but I'd suggest that Sinophone audiences get to know the stories and characters of the book perhaps just as often through these adaptations as they do through reading the 1592 original, which is of course very long. So one of the really striking things about the novel, to my mind at least, is that it's a novel about shape-shifting. You know, Monkey and Pigsy and so on, they're constantly shaping form in the story. So it's a novel about shape-shifting that has itself shapeshifted. To read Journey to the West is to get an understanding of characters, stories, and jokes that loom very large in the Chinese imagination. So in my last minute or so, I just want to give you a sense of the versatility and prevalence of the stories in the Chinese-speaking world. There are new TV or film adaptations in the Sinophone world in the mainland, Hong Kong or Taiwan, pretty much every few years. Pop stars incorporate the stories into their lyrics. The first ruler of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong, loved the novel. In fact, he was reading it in 1966 on the eve of launching the Cultural Revolution. And he told the Red Guards, the Hongwei Bing, that they should be like Monkey making war on heaven, that they shouldn't be afraid of smashing things up. China's current leader, Xi Jinping, has clearly read the book as well. So there's a story in the book where Monkey disguises himself as a fly and hides in the bubbles on top of a cup of tea being drunk by an adversary, the famous and fearsome Princess Iron Fan, so Tieshan Gongzhu. So Monkey hides himself in the bubbles on the top of a cup of tea. So he ends up being swallowed by her. And then once he's inside her, he starts doing some very vigorous kung fu. So he thumps her insides until she submits to him. And in 2013, Xi Jinping used this story as an analogy for how the Chinese Communist Party needed to infiltrate the parts of the internet critical of the Chinese government. But in addition to political leaders, rebels and creatives also love Journey to the West. So in the 1990s, when many young Chinese people were disillusioned with their government, students loved a 1995 film adaptation out of Hong Kong called A Chinese Odyssey. And this film portrayed Monkey not really as a superpowered superhero, kind of capable of dealing with every crisis, but rather it presented him as an aimless, rebellious drifter. There was something about the portrayal that seemed to capture the mood of that moment in China. So I suppose my point is that the novel, its stories and characters are like water. They fit around many different moments, moods and uses. Looking at the time here, I've definitely taken up my 20 minutes, so I'll hand back to May. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you later.
Well, thank you, Julia. Fascinating. What I found is you have a completely different lens as a non-native person, but also a historian. You look at it in a very different way from those of us who grew up with the story. And just by the way, for anyone who grew up with the culture, these characters, these four characters, Sun Wukong, Tang Seng, and Tang Seng is, what do you call him?
Tripitaka or Xuanzang, of course.
I'm going to refer to him as Tang Seng because that's deeply rooted in our brain. And Zhu Bajie, the pixie, and Sha He Shang, it's every kid's vocabulary. I think you will not find a single Chinese person who do not know these 4 characters. Is that fair, Julia?
I would definitely endorse that sentiment.
Yeah, it's like everyday life, right? So I'm curious. I'll start first at an odd place. I was reading to my daughter, and then there was this guest list to the Peach Blossom Festival that you were talking about a little earlier. And I compared both the Chinese version and the English version. I'm most amazed by the way you translated it. And the guest list to the Peach Blossom Party on page 51 reads, the Buddha, Bodhisattvas, the holy monks, the Arhats of the West, the ancient immortals of 10 continents and 3 islands. The list goes on and on. So I compared the notes, and here's my question. Even for someone like me, like these gods, the hierarchy are a confusing mix of Taoism, Buddhist society, Buddhist structure, maybe traditional Chinese civil society, and some astrology because the polar stars and all of that. How much research do you have to get into each of these fields to come to a realistic translation of what these names represent, these guests?
Well, first of all, you picked up on a really important point, which I should have emphasized, but I didn't. When I was talking about the religion in the novel, you have the 3 great teachings. You have Buddhism, you have Taoism, you have ideas that you would call Confucian. You also have ideas about the afterlife from Chinese popular religion. And they coexist quite fluidly together in a mix that we call syncretism, which is a very particular Chinese religious phenomenon. And it's quite hard with Chinese religion to point to a certain set of behaviors and beliefs that are purely Buddhist or sort of purely Taoist, because they all borrow ideas from each other. It's sort of incredibly fascinating process of kind of mutual sort of self-fertilization. But to return to your question, yeah, absolutely. The research to understand these very specific terms was a major part of the translation project. It wasn't a case that I could just sit down with the text and work steadily through it, always at the same speed. Sometimes I would spend hours surrounded by dictionaries and books about religion and get completely stuck on one term or a set of terms and only have translated perhaps a single short paragraph by the end because I was trying to work out what the original Chinese meant and how I could put it into English. And here I'd like to pay particular tribute to an amazing resource that I could draw on, which was the full translation by Professor Anthony Yu, who sadly passed away now, but for many years was in the comparative literature department at the University of Chicago. And he produced in the 1970s a full four-volume version of this enormously long book. It's 100 chapters in the original, and it's just a sort of wonderful scholarly resource, and it was invaluable to help me unpick some of the intricacies of that technical vocabulary. But also obviously I did my own reading outside Professor Yu's work, and a really happy outcome for me of having done this translation is that it's drawn me into that. I've taken a deep dive into reading about Chinese religion, which before I did the translation, I hadn't read much about since I was an undergraduate, really. And through this process, I learned so much, and I'm still learning, but it's just been a sort of sheer pleasure and constant source of fascination.
Very interesting. Actually, I didn't realize it had so much Taoism in it. And I see two comments in there. Maybe you can talk just a little bit about this syncretism, the combining of several religions together, or in Chinese, 三教合一. Thank you, Marilyn, for pointing that out. Right, quite a few people talked about this. how was that back then when the book was written? What was the influence? So they were a lot of Taoist gods, but they were on a Buddhist journey, right? And reporting to the civil Chinese society structure. What does it reflect about the society then when the author was writing, and how has that changed today? That might help us to understand the 三教合一.
Well, I think that it reflects the fluidity of, or the mix of religious beliefs held within the China at the time, which is not to say, of course, that all these different religious systems always coexisted perfectly peacefully. So in different dynasties, in different moments in Chinese history, there would often be rivalry between different groups. For example, at the imperial court, for example, if one emperor particularly started to favor Taoism, or particularly started to give a lot of money to Buddhist monasteries and monks, or if sort of Confucian officials would feel that religious figures, Taoist Buddhist religious figures, were getting sort of too much of a hold on a particular ruler's favors. So that conflict did exist, but I think that the ideal expressed within the book is one of syncretism, harmony between the religions. So there's one episode which I did include in the abridgment. There was a lot of difficult choices to be made about what to leave out, what to keep in, but there's a particular episode in Guo, the cart, which I translated as literally as cart slow kingdom. And in this kingdom, the ruler is portrayed as particularly stupid because he is persecuting the Buddhists and worships the Taoists, who are very skilled at doing all sorts of magic tricks, basically. And he's effectively, the king has been seduced by these three supposed Taoist immortals who, again, spoiler alert, turn out to be kind of animal demons or spirits at the end. And as usual, Monkey comes in to save the day and resolve all the problems, stop the persecution of the Buddhist monks. And at the end, he has a final message for the king, which is do not favor one faith over the other, allow the faiths to coexist in harmony. I don't know whether the fact that the author made that statement so clearly meant that he felt that was an ideal which was not being realized in Ming society at the time, but it was obviously an idea very dear to the heart of the author itself, of the author himself.
That's very interesting, because I feel like that there's a sense of all these different religions coexisting. There has generally been a comfort in the current Chinese society. I'm from Yunnan area, so we have also a mix of Catholicism, Christianity, Muslim, and local born religion, Buddhists, and in one village. All of them sort of live together. That still holds true. Okay, I see a lot of.
Sorry, I just wanted to add. That's really interesting what you say, because the book, the 100 chapter version, which I translated from, was first published in 1592, and that is published just a few years after, I think, the first Catholic mission has been set up in China. It'd be really fascinating to know what consciousness of this new religion was like in the mind of the author. Probably impossible to show. But I mean, one of the outcomes of my reading about the early history of institutional Taoism and Buddhism in China, so this is in the first centuries CE, is that the two faiths borrowed quite a lot of terminology from each other in order to win converts, in order to make their ideas comprehensible to people of other beliefs, of other faiths, even to the point that, you know, some people have argued, I think it's impossible to prove this, that some people have argued that Buddhism is a kind of Indian version of Taoism, that, you know, when Lao Tzu went west through the pass across the desert, that he ended up in India, and that's where Buddhism came from, and then it came back to China in the 1st or 2nd century CE. I don't think that's been proven satisfactorily, but it is a fact that in those early centuries that certainly Buddhism and Taoism borrowed a great deal from each other in terms of, you know, sort of understanding of how heaven and hell was going to be constituted, and also things about demons, the idea that disease was caused by demons. You know, there was a lot of intersection there.
Right, fascinating. But there was a comment asking about like which version of the book you translated from, which relates to my next, because right now I'm holding this book. It's actually a very fluid and quick read, even though it's thick, but it reads like Lord of the Rings and just you plow through it. Yeah. And I'm going to touch on some of your decisions on how to cut the original 4 volumes, which is 4 times this in thickness. And I have to say, in classical Chinese, for me, completely Chinese educated, it's just, I have to look up about 10 to 20 characters per page, the old textbook. And so I cannot believe, you know, I cannot imagine how much time it would take you to make the decisions to cut. So I'm going to go back to the same example of the guest list. In one place, for the peach party, you listed all the gods. But in another place, when you were talking about the monkey hanging out, you know, sort of befriending all the sages and stars and generals and guardians in sky, you sort of ignored the Chinese list of the names of these gods, but instead went for a quick sort of general term to name them. And I'm using this as an example, and feel free to use any other example to sort of share with us, how do you make them, I would call it translatorial or editorial cuts to the text. And as you're speaking, I'm going to go grab a shawl. I'm very cold. I can hear you. Go ahead.
No worries. Thanks, May. Well, first of all, one of these questions is slightly easier to answer, namely the text that I translated from. So I translated from the 1954 作家出版社, so writers publishing house version, which was put together in the early years of the People's Republic of China. It's the same version that Anthony Yu used for his University of Chicago Press full version. And it's thought highly of for having sort of resolved quite a lot of the sort of linguistic contradictions within editions which had arisen before then. So that was that choice. In terms of the very complex question of how to abridge, how to make these sort of editorial or translatorial cuts to the text, to me, well, there are many small individual challenges, but the big overarching challenge was how to build a bridge between contemporary Anglophone culture and a Penguin Classics audience, probably very little familiar with the fantasy worlds described in Journey to the West. So how to build a bridge between this culture, this audience on the one hand, to this work of the imagination of 16th century China, sort of full of Chinese mythology and fantasy. The novel paints a very rich, intricate picture of religious and spiritual belief in imperial China, with so many names of particular gods, demons, and religious processes like meditation, breathing exercises, or alchemy. So I'm not at all surprised, May, that you have to look up, I don't know, a dozen characters a page. You know, there are so many very particular names for animals or medicines or flowers. Yeah, there are all these very, very elaborate descriptive poems as well. So my challenge was how to evoke the exciting difference of this fantastical Chinese world while not losing the reader in too much extremely technical detail. And so every instance where that came up required me to make a judgment. And one of the criteria for making the judgment was how fast did I feel the story needed to travel at that point. And so going back to your very specific question about, how did I decide to include a whole list or to reduce a list, my decision to translate the whole list of guests that Monkey gets told about in the Peach Orchard was to do with comedy and psychology in the scene. So that scene, that speech, that announcement of all the guests is specifically set up to enrage Monkey. So he learns that anyone in the immortal world has been invited to the banquet, but that doesn't include him, and that also sort of sets him off on this path of destruction later on. So the list has to seem incredibly long and exhaustive for that joke to work.
Excellent. I think I quite admire you to be able to put the text down and sort of take a step back, think about the tone, the joke, the pace, which I clearly feel like reading this book, this version, it just flows. It's very, very masterpiece. Thank you.
But I mean, I should say that my first step for any translation, I mean, all my other translations had been full translation. So this was my first experience of abridging. But my first step is actually to do an incredibly literal, incredibly clunky word for word, also sort of preserving a lot of the rhythms of the original Chinese. No matter how strange it sounds in the English, I want it to be as literal as possible. And it's only when I come back to revise that I start to think about how things should work in English. And I think I need to go through that stage because I feel that otherwise I'm going to lose that Chineseness somehow. So I have to keep myself tied to the literal text through that first draft. And I never save myself out of it. I never override it. The first draft always remains intact. So I can, if I think I've been too free, I can go back to that original version and check myself.
Interesting, but for this book, you did not translate all the 4 volumes.
No, so my process was I did read the whole thing in the original, and then I decided. So as you know, as most people know, the first there's a prologue, and sort of the first 12 chapters introduce the main characters. So it's Monkey, Pigsy, Xuanzang, Tangzang, Shazong, Sandy, and the little dragon who becomes the horse. But then once they're on the quest, it's episodic. So most of the stories don't bring in characters which have been introduced before. Most characters on the quest, they appear once and then they don't appear again. So from that perspective, it's quite easy to abridge that because you're not collecting characters who need to be referred back to that you need to refer back to. So my job was to select the stories which I felt were most compelling, that brought out the most important themes in the book. Obviously I had to decide what were the most important themes in the book. But my technique was for organizing the abridgment was incredibly primitive. I read primitive, so very simple. I created a table in a Word document with 4 columns. The first column was a brief summary of the chapter in the original. Then there were 2 previous abridgers, Arthur Whaley, who wrote in the 1940s, and Anthony Yu also did an abridgment as well of his full translation. So then the next 2 columns, I noted whether Whaley or Yu had included an episode. And then the 4th column was for my own decision. So I had a kind of panorama of the whole book, a sense of what my predecessors had chosen, and then I made my own choice.
How much difference between your abridged version and the previous one? A third?
Possibly more. I mean, one of the things which I love both the previous abridgments. So I would say, you know, everybody, they should read several versions of Journey to the West, not just one. I felt that whether as a deliberate decision or not, Arthur Waley had left out quite a few of the episodes with interesting female characters. So I think I'm the first female translator of the book into English. So, for example, Arthur Waley had left out the Xiliang Nuguo, the country of the women story when the pilgrims get pregnant, which I enjoyed very much. He left out the Dudishan, I think the mountain of the toxic enemy with the scorpion demon. And he also left out Tieshan Gongzhu. You know, when I was talking to my Chinese friends, you know, which are the most important stories in Journeys to the West, you know, everybody would say Tieshan Gongzhu. Waley also left out Bai Gu Jing, so the white bone demon. So I felt that there were so many interesting stories about strong female demons, or this interesting gender reversal dynamic in Xiliang Nuguo, the land of women. I definitely wanted to bring those in. So something else I did in abridging, apart from just cutting certain stories completely, because there's a degree of repetition in there. You know, there are a lot of demons who want to eat Tripitaka. You don't need to have absolutely all those stories. But there's quite a lot of the traces of the earlier versions of the stories in the novel. So the novel didn't come from nowhere. It sprang from earlier oral versions of the story, which had been related by storytellers, or come through drama and theatre and opera. You can see some of those kind of oral storytelling origins still in the book. So there's sometimes the narrator recapitulates the plot at some length, as if he's a storyteller in a marketplace and he's worried that his audience has wandered off to do some shopping or they've just forgotten the detail. And I felt that wasn't necessary in a written text, because people can just flick a few pages back. So I managed to save some space that way. So I think I managed to include quite a lot more episodes than Waley did. But I had a very strict word limit. My editor said I couldn't exceed 100,000 English words. So I think the final version did come in at something like 99,993 words. I was really pushing it.
That's fantastic, and I can totally support the characters that Julia was just mentioning that were featured in this book. The Tieshan Gongzhu, the Bai Gu Jing, the white bone devil, or the princess with the iron fan, and the kingdom of women. As a girl growing up in China, those were essential stories. Those were absolutely. There's no way that can you talk about this book without mentioning those characters. So thank you for including them. Okay, there are lots of questions, but I think we want to address one of the questions that was sent in to us earlier from Michael Ruby. And in fact, there were quite a few questions. Julia, I think I sent this list to you. You probably had a look at this already. And mostly it's regarding the identity of Tang Sanzang和Xuan Zang, and also Tang Seng, you know, who is real, this monk, which character is he actually based on? And do you want me to read the question? It's a little bit long.
I mean, did you want to just sort of put, there's lots of really fascinating information in the question. I could briefly summarize them. So I think that about where might the body of the Tangsung of Xuanzang lie now? The questions referred to the Wikipedia biography of Xuanzang. Now, I can't verify every single detail within the Wikipedia biography of Xuanzang. Probably you would need to speak to a Tang historian, I guess, a specialist in Xuanzang to check all those details. Because Xuanzang, Tripitaka, Tangsong was himself such a famous and remarkable individual, temples were built in his honor at different points in different parts of the Sinophone world. So the Wikipedia page claims that some of his corporeal remains lay in Nanjing until the 1940s or 1930s, at which point they were removed by Japanese soldiers during World War II. I'm afraid I myself can't verify that. I suppose the best I could say is that Xuanzang is a very, very well-known and justly celebrated historical figure to whom temples were dedicated. There was also a question that this reader asked about the origins of the monkey character, because some argue that he might come from parts of Indian mythology. I think that scholars would concur that really there is no received wisdom on the origins of monkey, this absolutely sort of fascinating, spellbinding character. It's thought that the monkey character entered the story which became Journey to the West around the 13th century, and over the next 300 years came to dominate the story, really over Tripitaka. So you have this strange situation of the monk who was at the center of the story is no longer the hero. So Tripitaka in the novel Shioji, she doesn't come over particularly well. He's always tired, or he's grumpy, or he's hungry, and he's afraid, or he's cold, and he's very much reliant on Monkey to get him and the other disciples, the other pilgrims, out of all the scrapes that they get into. But the precise origins of, the various monkey stories that start to enter the narrative around the 13th century are very hard to pinpoint, and no one really agrees on the inspiration for Monkey. So there's one interpretation that traces him back to a legendary white ape within Chinese mythology. There's another idea that suggests that he sprang from the legend of a kind of monkey water demon. Others argue that he springs from Hanuman, who is the companion of Rama in Hindu mythology. So I think this is something that scholars will probably argue about forever.
Yeah, sounds like it. And that's all right. Actually, let me get to the Joyce Sin's question. This one's an easy one. Please explain the Chinese meaning of the monkey's name. Wukong.
Yes. So Wukong, he's given this name, sort of Sun Wukong. He's given this name quite early on in the book, after he's undertaken, I think it's in chapter 2 or chapter 3, and he has undertaken this very dangerous journey because he wants to learn to be an immortal. So he makes this pilgrimage to go and study for many years with a sage. Roughly speaking, it seems that the sage lives in the deep south of India, although the geography of the book, I should say, is somewhat mythological. One of the really fun tasks that I had made. Do you have a copy of the map in the book? Maybe you could hold it up for people. But one of the really fun tasks I had while the book was being edited was to I didn't draw the map myself, obviously, but I had to come up with a kind of sketch map showing the mythological route of the travelers. So the sage that Monkey learns from is right at the bottom of India. So he turns up at this sage's cave, and the sage agrees to accept him as a disciple. He can see Monkey's potential, and he says, right, well, I need to give you a name. I'm going to call you Wu Kong. So Wu means to wake or to be enlightened, to be enlightened. Kong, emptiness. So it literally means to become enlightened to emptiness. So this is again one of these sort of very interesting religious mix aspects of the novel, because this sage, everything that he teaches Monkey is Taoist. In fact, all the tricks, the transformations, the breathing exercises, the spells, it's kind of internal alchemy. It's very, very Taoist. And yet the resonances of this name, I think, are very Buddhist. So it speaks to this very fundamental Buddhist idea that everything is nothingness, that everything is emptiness, and that humans need to be aware of this so that they don't strive after pointless things. So this sort of very act of the naming of Monkey, of Wukong, is very steeped in this phenomenon of syncretism, sanjiaoheyi.
Which is, it's really interesting because the character is almost the opposite of wanting nothing. I mean, he cared so much about status and all that.
But it's kind of a foreshadowing, if you like, of the moral arc that Monkey will have to go through in order to reach the end of the book, in order to reach enlightenment. And that's how many readers have understood the book, as being all about taming. So that they see Monkey not just as a comic character, but as an allegory for the human mind. So the monkey, this character, is a metaphor for the sort of brilliance of human genius, but also its restlessness, the way that it gets into trouble and it needs to be tamed in order to reach its full potential. So in some ways, that's a very universal theme. So beneath the froth of the comedy and the action of the book, there's this actually very profound universal theme that, the book is about this balancing act that we all are doing between freedom and restraint and control. You have the sort of brilliant monkey who's so childlike and takes pleasure in so many things, and he jokes, but he's out of control. He needs to be limited in some way. And I think that's a really important, thought-provoking part of the book.
Yes, very much so. And I was I was sharing with Julia earlier, like my daughter reads the book and in the first couple of chapters, and she hated this monkey character. She said she's so annoying, which to me it was a complete shock. Anybody growing up in China is like, Sun Wukong is endearing. Even his mischiefs as a child, you view those as endearing. But I think your English translation brought the journey, the arc of Wukong, the character, better. Now, I'm going to jump out of this since we have 2 minutes left. I want to hear from you, Julia. It's more a larger, your scholarly body of work on China. I read one of the things you said, that this was a question. What historical topic have you changed your mind on? And you mentioned that. You said, China's relationship with the world beyond its borders. I changed my mind about it with every new piece of research. So I would love to hear more relating to current Chinese society and also your experience in translating this book. What has changed your views on China's relationship with the world beyond China's borders?
I think generally I try to question my perceptions, my beliefs, my assumptions, my biases all the time, not necessarily successfully, but at least try to do it. I think one of the great strengths, advantages of an education in the humanities, in the study of languages, history, culture, is that it tries to make you critical and self-conscious about everything you read or absorb. So as you read something, you're telling yourself, I'm not just reading it for plot, I'm not just reading it to understand the content, I'm also trying to understand the argument being made. You know, why has the author selected particular pieces of evidence? What are they trying to guide me towards concluding? What's been left out here? Also, for myself, I need to constantly think as I read, you know, what are my own biases, preferences, and past experiences doing here? How are they affecting the conclusions that I might be drawing from something? You know, what inferences or subtleties might I be ignoring? And I think to tie then this your question back to Journey to the West, one of the great pleasures and kind of ongoing intellectual journeys that the book started me on is this study of Chinese religion, the extraordinary mix of ideas, some of which in serious and less serious ways arguably are still present in Chinese society today. Probably less serious example of this would be I was reading about a funerary goods shop in Hong Kong selling paper versions of luxury goods, you know, Prada handbags and BMW keys and iPads. And the point of these funerary goods is you burn them at the funeral of the deceased, and by burning them they will go through to the afterlife. So the deceased will have useful things in the afterlife. And I felt this was this sort of very interesting contemporary echo of this very strong idea within Journey to the West that the afterlife will exactly resemble life in the mortal world, so life on earth. And in some way, with these funerary practices still in Hong Kong, you see an echo of this assumption that whatever is useful or covetable in my mortal life, I'll want those things in the afterlife as well. Again, this sense that the spirit world will bear a very, very close resemblance to the world that we're living in. And I sort of love this kind of down-to-earth pragmatism, but still this sort of deep spiritualism and the enormous complexity and intricacy of the way that Journey to the West and Chinese religious systems have worked out their sense of relationship with supernatural, fantastical forces. It took me on a transformative intellectual journey, and I'm still working through this material now.
Fantastic. And I just want to share, I've burned paper credit cards and a car for my grandma before. So the journeys of exploring China and China's relations with the world will continue. Lots more to discover and explore. Thank you so much, Julia. I could go on. I still have a long list of questions, but I think we should let you all, those in Europe, rest, and those of us in California probably go have lunch. Thank you again, and thanks everybody for participating. Next week, we'll talk to Jim Harkness, who is the director of National Geographic in China, well, a China country director. about National Geographic's involvement in China, and ongoing throughout June, we have many on-the-ground events via Zoom. Sign up wildchina.com. Once again, Julia, thank you. And if you don't have the book, go to amazon.com right now. It's a great read. Thank you.
Thank you so much, May. It's a real pleasure to speak with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.